Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're here today, the final day of the 13th annual North American Strategic Infrastructure Leadership Forum. And my name is Jennifer Schmitz. I'm the CEO of Lattice Industries. And ideally, what we're going to do today in one of our final panels here to wrap up all the hard work we've done over the week. And again, our prayers and thoughts go out to Norman, who's done such a good job setting this up. It's our job to execute today. So we're going to be joining with a few friends of ours that have come here to wrap up everything that we've heard, whether it was the hydrogen, the renewable energy, the infrastructure, basically wrapping up all those conversations with the most important one. How are we going to help pay for it all? So in the essence of bringing about what public and private means to infrastructure, we've created this final panel to really go over how do we actually create sustainable smart cities that actually bring revenue to help pay for all this infrastructure. And what we've focused on, and many times you'll hear that everyone's relying on data to help pay for some of these expenditures that are much more than any infrastructure bill could be. But how do we actually do that is really the question. So we're joined today in our panel from experts from the financial services, the communication telecom industry, the industry that also finances projects this big, to talk about what exactly is data, how do we use it, how do we make it beneficial as an asset, and most importantly, where data is concerned, there's also risk. And that risk has been laying on the end user for quite some time. So how do we take that equation and switch it around? And we're going to talk to experts in the field of finance that are going to help us walk through what happens when data has become a commodity. So with that, our panel of experts, we're going to be introducing each of themselves, but I'll do a brief introduction. We are going to be joining, our first panelist is Athria, who comes from us from Verizon Transportation Division. And his whole job is about, the communications company and how they're making their next future banking on data. The second panelist is Patrick Hickey from the Options Clearing Corporation out of Chicago that knows commodities better than anyone probably sitting in any of this infrastructure conference. And he'll talk to us about when things are commodities and then how do we organize a system where that system can set meta policy for the rest of an industry. The third person joining us on this panel is Melissa Barrett. Melissa's background is 30 years with Visa, the largest payment system in the world, and has set policy, has seen the ups and downs of big data moving on global networks. And we'll talk to her a little about that and what that means. And then finally, we'll wrap up where data and infrastructure and the systems and the partnerships that have worked that help actually expedite this issue, and some of the projects that can help fund the ancillary projects that are going on around the country now to expand that digital infrastructure to the local networks. So with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, who is coming from Verizon. Thank you, Athria, for joining us so early in Chicago. If you could please give us an introduction and then tell us a little bit about what does data mean to telecom today? So with that, Athria.
Thanks, Jen. Good morning, everybody. Really glad and happy to be here today. I'm coming to you from Chicago, quite rainy out here. As you know, one of the other panelists saying we've gotten rain all over the place in North America right now. But anyway, good morning. My name is again Athria Srinivasan. I'm with Verizon. I support the public sector domain team, particularly focused around the transportation, mobility, and infrastructure space. And this is a very exciting time around some of the initiatives that are going on here around data. And this panel and this event is particularly interesting because we from a Verizon's perspective or an MNO perspective, our primary goal is to be able to scale and bring to bear our core assets around our network, our connectivity, and the next generation of infrastructure around 5G and edge computing. And as we think about data, both from a public and private sector perspective, we want to provide the backbone for orchestrating real-time data exchanges between public and private sector, and provide that available data to make smart decisions. I mean, this is about smart cities, and again, if you really peel the onion back on that, it is about getting real-time data to make informed decisions on a timely manner. So as we transition to our, as we start transitioning into the next generation of 5G and Mac, we want to participate in this ecosystem where we provide the underlying infrastructure to transmit this data, to be able to provide real-time orchestration of this data. And that's where we see ourselves and how we can help both the public and the private sector realize the best value for the data that's available today. I mean, there's a lot of data that's right now available with the public sector as well as private sector. So what we're looking to do is collaborate with agencies and organizations such as OCC and other panelists here to understand how we can actually sort of figure out a business context and rules and governance and how we can actually monetize this so that everybody benefits from it and all the important stakeholders are part of that equation. So again, having said that, I just want to emphasize that we really want to be able to provide this connectivity so that people get access to the data at the right times. And we're looking to partner and engage with industry stakeholders, public sector, private sector, to understand how we can do this in a setting where there is good governance, there is good business models, so everybody can benefit from it. So with that, I want to turn this over to Pat. That with my brief introduction, we can definitely come back for any Q&As and other discussion items for him to talk through some of the things that we're talking about around that governance, around that data standards, and how we can actually figure out a business model to make this happen. With that, I'll turn it over to Pat.
Got caught on mute. Thank you for that intro. Yes, excuse me. I'm Patrick Hickey. I'm the Managing Director of Participant Services and Solutions at OCC, also known as the Options Clearing Corporation. The OCC is what's known as a CCP, or central counterparty, to the equity options industry. That was our that was what we were established at upon our founding 48 years ago. So what is a CCP exactly, and what role does OCC do? Essentially, OCC, the core function is for a CCP to stand between a buyer and a seller of a thing, we'll call it, and guarantee that thing goes to the buyer and funds or cash goes to the seller. So you can think of it as becoming the seller to every buyer and the buyer to every seller, and making sure that all of the things and the cash are moving through the system to the right folks at the right time, and that time is called settlement. So that needs to happen all in a predefined manner. What OCC does specifically with those things now is we service participant exchanges, which they're in the United States. There's 16 different options exchanges at the moment that are all commonly owned by, they're owned by the common well-known names like New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and CBOE, among others. But those exchanges provide the platform where those buyers and sellers can meet and exchange those things, which in this case are equity options contracts, so puts and calls. Those buyers and sellers are made up of market participants that are clearing members of OCC. So they're pre-approved members, not only of OCC but also of those platforms, the exchanges where they go and buy and sell options contracts. Now, those clearing members are made up of the largest banks in the United States, the Bank of America, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the like, and there's over 100 clearing members that OCC services as members today. So over time, and having established these standards of how business might transact in the equity options market, and building upon that experience over years, we've been able to now, as of last year, transact 7.4 billion options contracts that flowed through OCC from the exchanges, and delivered securities, the options contracts in this case, to buyers and cash to sellers. Now, the interesting tie-in here with data, as we've been working with Lattice the last year or so, is that the things that are traded now that OCC specializes in, the equity options contracts, could be anything. It doesn't need to be an options contract. It can be a futures contract. Those futures contracts can represent all sorts of things that underlie those contracts. 1,000 barrels of oil that trade at CME, or an equity index futures contract like the S&P 500. There's coming soon to an exchange near you, probably futures contracts with Bitcoin that underlie them, that are already up and running. So there's no so thinking outside the box, there's no reason that data, as we're talking about it here in this forum today, can't be standardized in such a way that it can look like a futures contract or an options contract or something else, that as long as those members can depend on what it is that they're receiving when they hand over funds, and the exchanges themselves are certain of what those standards are that they're offering to either buyers and sellers for a price, there's the opportunity here to create a repeatable process that's already been done before, in the case of equity options, to something like a data product that we're talking about here today.
So Pat, very quickly on that note, and we've talked a lot about this. One question that we have in the data world is there's many data exchanges. There's blockchains that are linked to them, smaller local networks in the cities that make up these smart platforms that'll be harvesting this data. Now, in financial services, the exchanges at the top level, which we call the institutional trading, those set meta policy that would then trickle down to the local exchanges that would help standardize an entire ecosystem that didn't exist before options were introduced in the 1980s. How did you guys go about getting the stakeholders to agree? And then what kind of structure, is it self-regulated, or how typically does this happen when people start up an exchange network to trade commodity futures or things like that? What role does the clearinghouse play with the actual members?
So that's a very good question. I talked a bit about the standardization of the products themselves that we clear and settle, but there's also the aspect of who the participants are and how they're standardized. And what it really comes down to, Jen, is creating a process anchored in the principle of open access for anyone that meets the standards that are already agreed upon. So we have standards for becoming a clearing member of the Options Clearing Corporation, and those the rules that we've set out qualify you to clear in certain different types of standardized products that we offer that are on this list here. You can be qualified for equity options, you can be qualified for index options, or futures products that we offer, among other things. On the exchange side, we have a process for how because there's two functions of the CCP. The first is I've been discussing, is clearing and settling the contracts themselves, and then the second is once those members own the contracts, it's a process of risk managing the counterparty risk that OCC now has, because we've put ourselves out to be the buyer to every seller and the seller to every buyer. We're assuming that counterparty risk now amongst everybody, not only for settlement, but for delivery of the contract terms, which in the case of futures or in options is structured basically around the seller agrees to deliver the underlying commodity of the future at a specified price at a specified time, and those terms it represents the risk to OCC that counterparty will actually deliver that. So the back to exchanges, we have a process in place also to allow exchanges and along with their products to come into this ecosystem if they meet certain qualifications and terms that deal with standardization and risk management, essentially. As far as governance now, you talked about and the regulatory aspect, OCC has a very unique place in the marketplace where we're governed in various degrees by the SEC because we offer securities products in the form of equities options. We're governed by the CFTC because we also clear commodity futures. And we're also regulated by the Federal Reserve Bank because we are designated a systemically important financial market utility, or SIFMU, under the Dodd-Frank Act of I would say 2013. So those the aggregate, let's say, of all of those regulatory organizations and what they put upon us has certain requirements on us to follow those rules. I mentioned a couple of them opening up about open access, having clearly defined rules and bylaws of how we are going to operate as a CCP. But essentially, for the purpose of this discussion around data, I think it's really about that principle of open access and predefined rules of the road about how buyers and sellers will actually interact in this ecosystem.
Perfect. So Pat, what you're saying, I think, to create in summary is there's a system out there that if we could figure out how to put data into a package that would fit within your rules, we could exchange that in very large quantities on exchanges today.
Yeah, that's right. If you scratch out equity options and replace it with widgets, okay, there's absolutely a model that exists today that can do that. And I think that the questions ahead on this path are how to relate the data that we're talking about here today into that widget package that I'm describing.
Okay, so with that, we're going to have somebody help us answer that question. Someone who has understood what a data contract is, and primarily the risks that have to be considered. And as you know, as you're talking about counterparty risk, all the financial exchanges and all the members of those exchanges love money, but what they love more is someone else to take the risk. And in this infrastructure world where everyone says they're going to, get data from smart cities and exchange that and monetize that data, the key here is to actually not necessarily be the one to monetize the data, it's to provide the platform. So as Pat can explain, it's a very good business to be in the exchange business, but what we need to do is shift that benefit, that money, those billions of transactions, and actually make the system make money. And if we were to publicly and privately pair on that system like a tollway, then that would be the people's money, which would help develop that infrastructure. So the first thing we need to understand is how big are those contracts? How complex are those contracts? And that's why we're going to talk to Melissa next. So with that, Melissa, we'd like to know all your knowledge about basically sharing big data and why Visa is not being grouped with Facebook right now. I'm sorry, Meta right now. And actually explain why there is a difference between social media having data and a company in financial services that has had data for the last 50 years and exchanged it perfectly fine and is still in existence today and sits on top of the S&P top 10. So with that, Melissa, can you help us out and explain what does a data contract and big exchange mean?
Yeah, well, so I'm not speaking on behalf of Visa today, but I will tell you that in terms of just a little bit of my background, I have held product responsibility for risk and identity products. I've held many, roles at the company, including head of global business intelligence, solutions delivery, and with that type of information, when you're talking about data, I'm also an advocate working to ensure that we all support diversity, inclusion, equity, all of those things. When you start talking about data, things like representation make a difference, right? So as I have learned working for a consumer, I was the CEO of a consumer reporting agency, maximizing possible accuracy, dispute resolution, consumer disclosure. We can kind of take some examples of what we heard Pat talk about with respect to authorization, effectively authorization, clearing, and settlement, and how we solve some of those problems in the industry and apply it to some of the other use cases as you're bringing up today. So when we talk about the management and utilization of data, which is, challenging, right? The ability to create the trust requires standardization of policies in a way that allows the industry to scale in a significant way. These contracts, when you're talking about passing data back and forth, understanding the use cases, the privacy policy, the data governance, the model governance, access to data, the authorized use of data, liability, security, risk, those are just a few of the critical aspects. But the standardization and transparency around what is going to be happening with that data, how is it going to be used, and certainly for state or city-sponsored projects and their citizens, what does that mean to them, and how can we create an environment that allows people to come in and really accelerate the process of negotiating those contracts and creating those standardized processes and policies. Additionally, the ability to anonymize the information across the industries. In this particular case, you're talking, it could be research, machine learning, non-financial, financial information of an exchange, for example. And so negotiating those contracts for these types of deals can easily take more than a year. I've been on contracts where it's taken us 3 years just to establish what the contract will include. So instead, in addition, helping citizens understand how that data is being used, the transparency around it, the impacts of inaccurate data or incomplete data sets, and certainly how they may impact diverse, underrepresented, or marginalized populations. So ultimately, how do we create use cases that begin with inclusion and representation? Pat talked about open access, for example, and allow us to accelerate development and scale while still building and maintaining trust. So as an example, testing autonomous vehicles to ensure citizens are represented at every stage of developing projects, for example. But the length of time when you're talking about negotiating on all of those different aspects can be daunting, especially when you toss in, and that's just between two potentially private companies. You know, you're talking about negotiating now with, you know, state-sponsored, you know, effectively citizens, you know, and having private companies come together to agree on what those processes are. So standardizing those policies on both sides, you know, similarly, if you think about the network between merchants and financial institutions, it's a very similar model.
Yeah. So, and that is why, to put it together, Melissa and I used to work at Visa, and we had worked on contracts even together that were between the biggest bank in the world and the biggest, you know, merchant in the world. And what they were actually having that contract was actually data. It wasn't about necessarily exchanging money. It was about how do we form rules of engagement to trade data. And on average, that was 2-3 years of work each time. So the commodity exchange, if we were to interact that and infiltrate the commodity exchange model with, say, a payments model for this new big sets of data that are going to be transferred along the supply chain from the producer to the port, if we can create connected corridors, not only will we provide an avenue where we have equity going back to citizens, switching that model. In fact, the idea here is to switch it from what is constraining it. So for instance, rural broadband, things that will help, you know, expand can't be funded by subscribers alone. What we need to do is we need to change that model to the content providers, paying for the access to the citizens whose data it actually is. You know, data, the big question, and we've heard this all along, whose data is it? So Melissa, one of the questions that I have from the audience, and everybody wants to know, whose data is it? You've known these lawsuits and the high things that the payments industry and the credit card companies have gone through. So what's the official answer when somebody asks you, whose data is it?
Well, I think the data itself, it's the citizens' data, right? So when somebody's making a decision about me, are there ways for them to anonymize information? Or if it's being used in a particular type of transaction, say, you know, a financial decision, you have to make sure that you are, you know, that you have accuracy with that information and that you understand how it's going to impact the citizen at the end of the day. Is it an adverse situation, for example?
Right. So in the case of smart cities and part of the Lattice Industries model for a data as a commodity exchange in these regional networks, to add on to these arterial networks, the purpose is that we can basically become self-reliant, and we don't necessarily need to go back to the government, and those fees that are generated from the mutualization of those stakeholders leveraging a very large institutional system. It enables those ancillary systems to save that money that's been handed to them by the government and actually push out to the last mile. And that's really the goal that we're looking at in the structure, is where we're looking at infrastructure. Because we know you can have $5 trillion, Melissa, and it doesn't even tip the, you know, it doesn't even tip the scale, but, you know, a little tiny bit. These networks are extremely expensive. They cost a lot of money, and they always cost more money for reinvestment of the technology, because there's compromises that can occur along the way, which we've seen with ransomware, right? Now, in the case of blockchain, everyone has smart contracts, Melissa, and one of those things, they're like, oh, that's just cybersecurity. But what you've known is more than just a cybersecurity risk. There is a social risk. And we don't want to start this data as a commodity along with the infrastructure in the digital infrastructure world without packaging this up properly. And so with what that means, it really depends on anonymity. And that anonymity is what's called commodification. So if we can make what is sitting for free right now, that is generated from states, traffic signals, environmental signals. For instance, we've talked a lot about hydrogen fuel. The idea of carbon credits, it's self-reported right now, doesn't work, can't trade it. Now, if we could use sensors to quantify this, which can be accurately estimated and also audited, and we heard a lot about government projects that will have government auditing. Well, the same thing will occur with the data. So there's two paths. One, We can do it the way it's working, the Wild West. It doesn't work very well, and really there's nobody to tell if that data is actually accurate. 2, we can change and go into a standardized system that, from what Pat says, sounds somewhat already created. So do you think it's possible to create what would be an immutable, commoditized data contract?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I think, but I think what's required is that you have to have a level of standardization and governance built into the process on both sides so that you have the ability to scale. So if you think about specific standards in a particular space, creation of standards here, ensuring that you have the ability to validate those standards and that folks are abiding by those standards, then absolutely, I think you begin to see some acceleration.
Okay, so with that, let's go to Elliot Jamison. So Elliot is coming from the plenary group, but he had a little bit of a very interesting background at Macquarie, working on some of these public-private partnerships that put these big communications and the citizens together in public-private partnerships. So Elliot, with that, if you can give us a little bit of your background and then maybe a few examples of where this has actually worked.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to do so. So my name is Elliot Jamison, Senior Vice President at Plenary Group, and we're an investor and developer of public-private partnership infrastructure projects. So I'll just mention two that may be relevant to this discussion. And the work we really do is at that physical infrastructure level. So around creating the backbone networks over which data travels. I've worked at a couple other infrastructure developers prior to Plenary. One of them, as you mentioned, was Macquarie, where I was closely involved in the Kentucky Wired project, which was a public-private partnership with the Commonwealth of Kentucky to build what's called a middle-mile fiber network that goes statewide, and in the first instance connects a number of state government and some local government agencies and offices and serves their data needs directly. In the process of putting in that network, there's an opportunity with fiber network builds to essentially increase capacity for very little marginal cost. Putting in 288 count fiber costs not much more than putting in 144 count, and you can go on up from there. So the goal and the approach in that project was to put in additional fiber, which then could be commercialized or sold to wireless carriers, network operators, local ISPs, whoever it was, both on that network itself, and I think importantly, as a way to facilitate the last mile fiber networks as well, which have challenging economics, as you mentioned. And part of the reason is it can be difficult and expensive to get back to a major internet hub from a more rural community. And this middle mile network really serves that role. So that was one. There are also a couple of similar but slightly different projects that I've worked on at Plenary and that we've actually closed over the course of the last year. I'll mention one of those, which is for the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. And they were upgrading their own communication needs again. And so for their transition to all electronic tolling, had a need for additional fiber backbone capacity across the turnpike and connecting roadways. And again, in the course of doing that, made the decision to allow, in this case, our group won the rights to do it, to install additional fiber laterals, other communication infrastructure alongside there, again, to be sold to people who have a need for that infrastructure. Mostly major carriers, some smaller regional ISPs again. And then there's a revenue share that we have with the Turnpike Commission, where some of that revenue flows back and helps to kind of meet their needs. So happy to go into more detail as appropriate, but those are kind of the couple of the types of projects that we've worked on and where we see a lot of opportunity for collaboration between public and private sector in kind of meeting a baseline public sector need to start with, but doing it in such a way that there's additional upside opportunity from bringing on private users.
So let's go back to what we talked about, the ancillary networks. A lot of part of, as we know, the bills going through the Senate right now are related to the broadband. And in the case with Athria, who's expanding and wants to leverage the data, these are very large systems, and you've seen this. And so let's go back to Athria. Athria, if Verizon was able to basically join paths with, a public, let's say a public region, there is a part where you feel maybe sometimes that might be a better model than having to completely pay for that on a private level. Would you expand just a little bit more, and we'll wrap that up, and then we'll come back and kind of summarize what our future lies with the digital infrastructure.
Yeah. So again, I couldn't speak to Verizon's policy, but what I can suggest, what I can speak to is around the fact that shared infrastructure is beneficial to everybody, right? As Eric talked about, having a public-private partnership where you have a public entity providing the right-of-way to build those infrastructure, and then you can lease that back to an MNO like Verizon, and then having a revenue share model so we get access to the customers on the back end. So those are the types of models I think everybody is looking for, because the capital investment on expanding network and building more fiber or even small cells is exorbitant. And you can't reach everybody because North America is pretty large and there's a significant digital divide between the urban and the rural sector. So there's a lot of opportunity here to explore those kinds of avenues. And from our standpoint, we want to be able to play in that sandbox, however we can contribute to the larger issue around transmitting data and having access to data, so everybody gets their fair share to accomplish their goals. So I think from an overarching perspective, I think there is a value in having all of these things in cohesion to be able to scale, right? So I again, this conversation is very timely, considering there's a lot of discussion in the the federal government around monies being allocated to projects like this, and we want to be at the table to participate in it and shape some of that discussion around where we can provide value and also address some of the gaps in the system. Hope that answers your question.
So to summarize, there's a traditional model in a P3 that leases out the lines. If we were to take that one step forward and part of that governmental line and those governmental services, and we create an avenue that we can exchange somewhat like a financial system on top of it, of those commodity contracts with the data all wrapped up in them, and we could speed that process up. In essence, what we would do is not only be able to pay for the system, but the equity holders of that system, both public and private, the members, they would be able to actually benefit beyond just the infrastructure cost. In fact, there might be a positive revenue to help expand that ancillary even further to, as what you self-described as too hard to get to because America's too big, right? So to wrap up everything, and there's a little bit of time, maybe Pat, if you could give your future outlook. If there was an ability to create a data contract, do you feel as though the private industry, the banking, the financial industries would take hold of this and help develop this ecosystem?
Yeah. So thanks for that, Jen. That's a good lead in. I was in listening to the commentary here. There's one interesting aspect about what standardization brings, and it's kind of a sea change from what it sounds like the model is now. I heard the model today is kind of described as taking years to negotiate terms of the contract, whereas what standard contracts can offer to participants is that certainty about what those terms already are, and then let the price be the thing that is allowed to move around in real time, even as buyers and sellers so choose. And it becomes the marketplace is determining the value of the data and the standards that were chosen for that contract, and the buyers will go towards those contracts that have the best value to them. Maybe it's the amount of data that's in the contract. Maybe it's about the security features that are in the contract. Maybe it's about the aggregation features, about how what different kinds of data is in there. We don't know. The data is just data until the buyer kind of determines what's valuable to them and have them participate in that. And then once they go to products that are the most valuable to them and whatever their use of the data is, there will be more sellers producing the same kinds of data or data products in the same standardized way, or enhanced to be even better than those based on the buyer's feedback from kind of working through that. And maybe that's a better use of time, which is spent like 3 years bilaterally now just with two parties, and you can get input from all sorts of parties, from both sellers and buyers of these products going on in the future. So that aspect there, once value is established from the buyers of these contracts, I can't imagine banks or financial market participants to be necessarily interested from the seller's point of view, but absolutely from the buyers, if they see opportunities to kind of piece together their own products, let's say, that put together multiple sellers of different types of things that the data tells different types of stories, let's say, that we haven't even thought of here. Let the market kind of think of those stories and offer a platform where you're inviting that to kind of happen. I think that's what, at a very high level, I think that's what banks and financial intermediaries would be most attracted to. And then from there, once that type of activity is kind of going on amongst buyers and sellers, then that gets into we talked about what OCC's wheelhouse is with widgets and clearing and settling and risk managing. Market intermediaries and participants that we service, their wheelhouse is matching up buyers and sellers maybe making introductions, maybe offering combinations of products together, maybe offering subscription-based services to receive the products. I'm just kind of talking out loud now, but those are the types of things that if there's an opportunity to provide a service and add value to their customers as well as to their own bottom line, I think they would absolutely come along for this ride.
Okay, perfect. So with that, and I think I've intertwined everyone's questions that I had all listed down here. So with that, I think we'll summarize everything. And I think the biggest summary we have is, in general, and everyone on this panel deals in the global world of data, communications, infrastructure. What we've seen is that this is something that's not only necessary, but needed. We need to scale. We need to do it quickly. We're far behind. America in general is so far behind that we all have to collaborate now. And I think we could all agree that the only way to tackle how far we are behind is to accelerate it twice as much. And to do that, we need the standardization, and we need all the partners and stakeholders to agree that there is value in creating a system that is shared. And so hopefully some of this is resonating with our legislators at this moment, but there is an established way to actually create revenue from systems that we could put in as digital infrastructure that will help pay back these large investments that the people have to do. And so that's kind of our main theme. And I think with that, we'll wrap up our discussion. Thank everyone for participating. Thank everyone who's attended the conference. We hope to grow from this conference and see much better things. And with that, I will return it to our hosts.